Now let us start with the session. Struts 2.x. Struts 2.x. Struts 2.x. See now here, why to go for Struts 2.x? Struts 1.x is there already, and why the industry peoples was entering into this Struts 2.x? In Struts 1.x there is some disadvantages. That's the reason we are entering into the 2.x. Not only this framework, we can take any framework. If you are moving to the one version to another version, means there is some drawback in previous version. That is the reason we are entering into the new versions. Now 1.x, Struts 1.x was not satisfied by the completely customer needs. Customer needs was not satisfied by the Struts 1.x completely. That is the reason we are entering into the Struts 2.x here. Customer needs means, for example, look and feel is good. Okay, initially they are going to use it by the JSP technology, presentation purpose. Whenever we are using the presentation purpose JSP technology, look and feel is not good. That is the reason customers was not satisfied by that look and feel. That is the reason different customers was going to be given to the complaints to the client. Now client is asking to the another presentation technology. Previously in our project we are using what? JSP technology, right? Or HTML. Now JSP and HTML is not given to the look and feel is good. Okay, that is the reason the client is saying we have to use frame faces, or we can use AngularJS, or we can use, okay, so now facelets. Like this different web technologies are there. Those web technologies was going to be given to the look and feel is very good, right? So now that is the reason we are going to be coming to from this Struts 1.x to Struts 2.x. Struts 1.x doesn't supported by the facelets, AngularJS. Okay, so now frame faces, such a type of web technologies was not supported by this Struts 1.x. Whereas Struts 2.x is supported by the everything. Every web technologies, every presentation technologies is supported by this Struts 2.x. That is the main reason to our entering into the Struts 1.x to 2.x. Right, 1.x to 2.x. Now initially Struts 1.x was implemented by the Apache Software Foundation company, you know that point, right? Now in order to provide the more flexibility for customers, now the Struts 1.x, that means Apache Software Foundation company, is proposal to the another company called TI framework. Okay, is proposed to the TI framework. Proposed to the TI framework. Struts TI framework, otherwise Struts TI framework. So now we can use this Struts TI framework, and we can developing the presentation logic is good. But whenever we are integrating that Struts 1.x to this TI framework, okay, lack of predefined API support is required. Now if you want to use that lack of predefined API, then unnecessarily increasing the burden on the developers. Okay, unnecessarily increasing the burden on the developers. In order to overcome that problem, once again the Apache Software Foundation company is approaching to the another company called, that is Open Symphony. This is the another company. This is the another company. Now the Apache Software Foundation company is approaching to the another company called that is Open Symphony. This company was developed by the one small framework called that is WebWork2. WebWork2. This is the another framework. Using that WebWork2, we can developing the total MVC2 related applications. MVC2 related applications. WebWork2 is the framework. WebWork2 is the framework developed by the Open Symphony company. Open Symphony company. And finally, Struts 2.x means Struts 2.x means some of the features was going to be taken by the Struts 1.x and WebWork2. WebWork2. Combination of these two frameworks we call them as Struts 2.x. Struts 2.x. Combination of Struts 1.x and WebWork2 we call them as Struts 2.x. Struts 2.x. Now, what are the major differences between the Struts 1.x and the 2.x? We will see in this session. But without knowledge on Struts 1.x, directly we are involving to the Struts 2.x. Okay, we are unable to understanding that total concept. But Struts 1.x also is mandatory, right? See now here. What is the major differences here Struts 1.x and 2.x? We will see here. Struts 1.x and Struts 2.x. Struts 2.x. In 1.x, we can use the front controller called action servlet. We can use the front controller called action servlet. Action servlet. We can use front controller called action servlet. Whereas in Struts 2.x, we can use the front controller called filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher. Why to go for this action servlet to that filter dispatcher? This is not a thread safe. Action servlet is not a thread safe. Whereas filter dispatcher is the thread safe. Thread safe. So that means thread safe and non-thread safe means it is going to be allowed by the in middle of the request different threads, even though it is not completing first thread execution. In middle of the first thread execution, it is going to allowed by the any other threads. But filter dispatcher doesn't allow like that. That is thread safe. This is not a thread safe. But in real time, must and should thread safe is required. Right? Thread safe is required. The next second difference is what is the second difference here? The second difference is whenever we are using the Struts 1.x, we can use different JSP tags. We can use different JSP tags. For example, HTML form. Okay, the next here logic, otherwise tiles, insert, the next bean message, etc. Like this different tags we are going to use in 1.x, whereas in 2.x we can use only one tag, that is s colon text, s colon password, s colon, okay, not empty. Like that we can use every place yes only, right? The next third different, right? Third different, whenever we are using the struts 1.x, okay, struts 1.x, what we have to do, we have to use forward action tag. While displaying, we can use forward action tag. If you want to displaying the any views, whereas whenever we are using struts 2.x, we can use the result XML tag. Result XML tag. The next, whenever we are using the 1.x in struts configuration file, we can use root element called struts-config. Whereas in struts 2.x, root element called struts. Then next, if we want to configuring the any action classes, first we have to take what? Action mappings. Whereas whenever we are taken struts 2.x, we can take what? Package. These are all new elements on it, struts 2.x. Okay, the next, in 1.x, form bean and action classes we can develop separately. Form bean and action classes we can develop separately. Whereas in struts 2.x, action classes and form bean we can develop in a single class. Form bean and action class, both we can develop in a single class, that is action class. Right, that is action class. Now next difference, struts 1.x was supported by the presentation technologies. Struts 1.x was supported by the presentation technologies. Only HTML and JSP. Whereas 2.x was supported by the frame faces, comma facelets, the next different view technologies was supported by this 2.x. Eighth, action servlet internally is going to be taking the help from request processor class. Take the help from request processor class. Filter dispatcher was going to be taken by the help from interceptors. Interceptors are internal concepts. These are all major differences between Struts 1.x and 2.x. Okay, 2.x. Now, if anybody is asking, we can give these differences, right? These differences. Now, here Struts 2.x request flow we will see here. 1.x, you know, right? In the same way, 2.x also some request flow is there. What is that request flow here? Now just observing. Struts 2.x request flow. It is very simple. See, now this is the browser. So we have to take the next difference. In Struts 1.x, Struts configuration file name is any name we can take. Next, 2.x. In Struts 2.x, must and should we have to take struts.xml. Right? Next difference. Struts configuration file we can place any folder. That means a WebINF folder na, classes folder na, wherever you want we can place, we can give the configuration time that path, init param, right? Next, Struts 2.x. Struts 2.x, in Struts 2.x, Struts configuration file must and should we can place must and should we can place inside the classes folder only. Inside the classes folder only. Okay, inside the classes folder only. Right. Now I'll see the struts 2.x request flow. This is my client. http://localhost:2014 project number, the next URL pattern. Now we can enter the username and password and click the submit button. First the request is reaching to the web container. This is web container. This is web container. This is web container. Now the request is reaching to the first web container. Now this web container responsibility is to load the web.xml file. Web.xml file. Web.xml file. Inside this web.xml file, I configured filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher. I configured filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher. Now this filter dispatcher is going to forwarding to the request internally action proxy. Action proxy is the predefined class. Action proxy. Action proxy. Right. This action proxy is going to be forwarding the request to configuration manager. Configuration manager. This configuration manager responsibility is to load the struts configuration file. Struts.xml. Struts.xml. Internally, this is going to be loading to the struts configuration file and handovering to the action proxy internally. Handovering to the action proxy. Now this action proxy, okay, is handovering to the action invocation class. Is handovering to the action invocation class. Is the predefined class action invocation class. Now this action invocation class is going to be activating the some interceptors internally. Interceptor 1, interceptor 2, interceptor 2, the next, and so on, interceptor n, interceptor n. Then finally this interceptor n is going to be activated by the action class. Action class. Inside this action class, execute method is there. execute method is there. So under that we can write the some logic. Under that we can write the some logic. Close the execute method, close the action class. Now this is the way to activating to the action class, and finally this action class is going to be executed. If it is small business logic, okay, otherwise it is going to be communicating to database. It is going to be communicating to database. If it is big logics, communicating to database. Communicating to database, and it is given response back to the client. Now once again the request is going to forwarding to like this back. Now this action proxy is going to response back to the filter dispatcher. Now this filter dispatcher is going to be producing to the an actual output. Then finally this page is going to be producing back to the browser. This is the Struts 2.x flow. Okay, but in Struts 1.x here, what is going to be activated here? Here request processor is going to be activated. Struts 2.x interceptors are going to be activated internally. Okay, interceptors are going to be activated internally. This is Struts 2.x flow. Now action servlet was implemented by the based on that servlet technology, right? Action servlet is one of the front controller. Action servlet is one of the front controller. That front controller was implemented by extends HTTP servlet only internally. In the same way, filter dispatcher was implemented by the filter interface. In servlets, you know the filter interface, right? So now this filter dispatcher was going to be implemented by the filter interface internally. Whenever we are taking the action servlet, how to configure? Whenever we are taking the action servlet, so inside the web.xml file we can take servlet by servlet and the next servlet mapping by servlet mapping, right? Now here we are taking the filter dispatcher. Filter dispatcher is one of the filter class, right? But not a servlet, right? So whenever we are taking the filter classes, now how to configure that filter classes? Now we can configuring that filter classes as like as follows. Now